Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing India's efforts to expand its trade partnership with Africa. Our distinguished panel includes Aparna Pande. She's the director of the Hudson Institute's initiative on the future of India and South Asia here in Washington. From Boston, we're joined by Larry Seruma. He's the managing principal of Nile Capital Management. Also with us is Andrew Leung. He's an international and independent China strategist now based in Hong Kong. Thanks again to all of you. Aparna, I want to move on to political cooperation between India and Africa. One of the issues that was discussed at that African summit was India's desire to get a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. Let's take a listen to what Prime Minister Narendra Modi had to say about this. Let's watch.
This is a world of free nations and awakened aspirations. Our institution cannot be representative of our world if they do not give voice to Africa, which is more than a quarter of UN members, or the world's largest democracy with 1/6 of humanity. That is why India and Africa must speak in one voice for reform of the United Nations, including its Security Council.
So here we have India wanting to get a bigger voice internationally, wants to have some diplomatic clout around the world. Do you believe that it's going to get the backing of Africa in this effort?
Yes, but there's a slight twist. I mean, if you actually read the statement that was issued by the at the African summit by the African countries, it said that they sympathized and they're in agreement, but there was no endorsement. So I believe that while that most of the countries would like India to be part of it, I also believe they would like an African country to be on the Security Council as well. So I think that's the part where there's a slight, yes and no answer.
Yeah, there has been talk of South Africa or Nigeria.
Yeah, so I mean, if it has to be, if the Security Council is expanded, then not just Brazil, Germany, Japan and India, but a country from a continent which isn't represented should also be on it. I believe that's part of the thing. They do support India's candidature, but they would also like an African country on it. I believe that's the thing. And India's been seeking a seat for a long time now, and not just from the UN. India would like institutions like the World Bank and the IMF also to be reconstituted, so that India and the other developing countries have more of a say on those institutions.
Right. Larry, what about expanding ties in security? At the moment, India is already the largest contributor to UN-mandated peacekeeping forces in Africa. Its personnel number something like 30,000. And India is also considering a request from Cameroon to train its defense forces to combat Boko Haram in West Africa. So what's the potential there?
I think this is not an area where India has been very successful in the past. And the new efforts, again, are very admirable and really a way in which India can get more engagement into Africa. But I would say that I would venture on the security side, there are a lot of areas where India can help out Africa, especially with regard to the technology or telecommunications. Africa has its complexity. We're talking about 54 countries, and all of them very unique and different. So it's much more difficult to have a security kind of approach for the entire continent. So probably it has to be done from a country-by-country basis, especially focusing on those areas where India has more ties, say East Africa or Nigeria or South Africa. I can see some element of success there, but on level of engagement on the security side, I think I would say it has to be seen on a country basis as opposed to to Africa as a continent. I would also say that one of the elements that's happening in Africa is that you are having much more peaceful transitions of power. And if India can contribute more into these areas, I mean, that would be also a welcome signal in terms of further engagement into Africa. So we'll wait and see what the results show, but it's a good signal. But I think it will be difficult to pull up an Africa strategy. It will be much more better if it's just more targeted, perhaps starting with the countries where India has the most ties.
Right, Andrew, what is China's engagement with Africa in those two areas, security and diplomacy? Is it very similar to India's, or is it very different?
Well, I think it's quite different, because China's engagement with Africa dates back a long, long time, even before the founding of the People's Republic. But also, China in recent years has developed very close relations with almost all the countries in Africa, much more broad-based than India. And that's why all the African countries together form a very, very powerful platform in the United Nations. Whenever anything agenda comes for discussion, for debate, and China would have a lot of friends in Africa. And that's why the Modi administration is trying to catch up and trying to broaden its relationship. And this is exemplified by the latest summit in New Delhi in October, engaging almost all the 54 countries and involving 40 heads of state. And the idea is to broaden India's relationship so as to gather more support in the United Nations for this bid for a permanent seat in the Security Council. Even though the chances on that are quite slim, because there are other very powerful claimants, for example, Japan, and indeed, sort of as my colleagues were saying, some African, Africa would like to have an African country represented there. But on the other hand, having a lot more friends in Africa would give India a much wider support to play a more important international role.
And Larry, what is your view on this relationship between China and Africa insofar as diplomacy and security are concerned?
I'll echo some of the points, Dan. When I look at the Chinese engagement in Africa, it tends to be much more between government and government. Even the companies that do business in Africa, they are really very much tied to the Chinese government. So those intergovernmental relationships are far much more different than India's engagement in Africa. From a business and a trade standpoint, we tend to see more company to company, and the government is sometimes just stepping in to assist. Whereas when I look at Chinese relationship, they tend to be much more tied into the government itself. So government to government has created a different type of engagement between China and Africa, and India is a little bit more distance in terms of really just looking at the Indian corporates or Indian institutions to really be more engaged in Africa, and India being there as a facilitator. So, I mean, those, will definitely mean different things to different countries. But, for the most part, we see Chinese engagement to be much more stronger on a government-to-government basis.
Aparna, one of the other things that was mentioned at that summit was climate change. And can we expect to see more cooperation between India and Africa on issues like climate change as well as international trade agreements?
Absolutely, because it is something which if you look at India, and Mr. Modi has mentioned in many of his trips, what he started to do in his frequent travels, almost 30 countries, is that when he goes to a country, while he mentions trade and historical ties, he'll also tweak it to that particular country or that region's requirements. So climate change is important to many countries in Africa. It's important to India. Digital technology, so there's a Pan-African India e-network, which India has pushed for, and which will be beneficial to many other countries, because it's a way in which India can provide a technology which helps countries which are still developing and which don't have the infrastructure, but digital technology can help you actually, provide education, training. So he tweaks what he does to different parts of the world, and so climate change is one of those issues. Education is one of those issues. Infrastructure, agriculture, and rural development. Again, where India can provide.
What about the promotion of democracy, something that Larry mentioned? India is the world's biggest democracy. Does it form a good model for for African countries?
It does. I mean, India believes it's a model in many levels, but there's been a reluctance to push democracy, because of the belief that, it should be indigenous. So if a country needs help, for example, when Egypt had elections, Egypt asked for Indian observers, and India was happy. But India would not send them unless they are requested by that particular country. So India would like to work with democracies, but India is not going to stop working with a country only because it's not a democracy, or try and impose a democracy. That's the Indian view.
Okay, and we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.